Hello, I'm Dave Spiller and I lead the BSc Archaeology course at Truro College in Cornwall, the only archaeology degree in Cornwall, in fact. And when we think about Cornish archaeology, we tend to think about some of the amazing prehistoric monuments you can see throughout Cornwall. The iconic Men and Toll, Lanyon Coit, the Nine Maidens Stone Circle, really sort of beautiful and imposing prehistoric monuments. We tend to think less about the Roman period, really. Traditionally, we don't think of the Romans as doing much in Cornwall. There's no Roman town there. The Roman roads go no further than Exeter, or at least their main roads. But in recent years, people have been starting to detect a bit more down there. There's a very interesting example of what looks like a Roman legionary marching camp that people are getting quite excited about at the moment. But really, a lot of problems remain. Cornwall isn't connected to the big economy of Roman Britain as much as other parts of Roman Britain are. You don't get many coins there, so it's very difficult to date sites often without that reliable, those reliable, clear dates that you get from coins. However, there are a number of sites over that period that are really very interesting. One that I'm particularly fond of is the ancient village, though it's possibly a bit small to really call a village, at Carnuni, which is an enclosed kind of courtyard area. It's very different from what we classically imagine the Roman period to be, almost a sort of fusion between British native Iron Age architecture with round buildings and the focus more on some stone rectilinear structures that you see coming in as that continental Roman influence. It's a fascinating site because of how walls enclose the site. These walls are not strong enough to be extremely effective defensively like we see with the round settlements that so characterise Cornwall in the Iron Age and into the Roman period, where you have big defensive ditches. But this is about the control of space, how you can enter a settlement, how you can control access for people visiting, and of course control where animals are going too. What Carnuni has, which is really quite fantastic, is a fogou, an underground chamber of a kind that you see to an extent in places in Wales and Scotland as well. But typically what these fogous are like are these quite long, winding, difficult passages underground in these stone-lined chambers. The interpretation of this has been quite difficult over time, partly because people sometimes wonder whether this is for storage, and yet they are built very inconveniently. People have wondered whether it's defensive, whether the idea is your enemies attack and as refuge you run down the corridors of the fogou, which are difficult to get out of. But often that only will get you into a tight hole, really. And of course there are some fogous, such as the one they've been excavating recently at Bowden, where you can get out the other end as well, and it runs outside of the earthwork surrounding the settlement. So usually these are interpreted now as ritual places, as these dark, cavernous, tight places, sacred under the ground. There are some wonderful examples that you can visit. Haligi fogou is an excellent one. There is also a fogou which is unfortunately closed to the public at the nearby ancient village of Chichester, which is very similar to Carnuni and somewhat bigger. But what's great about Carnuni is you can just go any day and it's free, and walk down into the fogou, which, unlike most, is one big round chamber, quite easy to access, and it's interesting question of whether this has a different function because it seems more practical to get into, or whether it's just a different type of ritual being conducted into this later Roman period in Cornwall as opposed to the sort of classic Iron Age fogous. But Carnini remains an interesting site. Our difficulty is with knowing how long occupation goes on there. Our artefacts, I suppose, are broadly of a Roman type, but it can be very difficult to work out when that kind of occupation ends. If you go there, you'll see on signs that the occupation is till roughly 400, but we really don't know. That's just a vague estimate people make based on types. The problem is with the 5th century, with the post-Roman period, is people forget how to make pottery on wheels and instead go back to making handmade pottery, which really resembles Iron Age pottery. So when these sites are investigated, it's very difficult to tell the difference, and there are certainly more examples of that I could come to. Of course, when we get to the post-Roman period in Cornwall, the really famous site is Tintagel, and people are indeed in Cornwall very proud of Tintagel, because what we see there is something almost more Roman, as it were, than anything in Cornwall during the Roman period itself. What you get there are a set of many stone rectilinear houses on what then was a headland is now practically an island due to the erosion of the sea over the years, and indeed the site at Tintagel is still threatened by the sea. Excavations have been conducted a number of times over the years, initially by an enterprising fellow called Raleigh Radford in the 1930s, sort of responsible for laying the groundwork for so much of Cornish archaeology. Then again in the 1990s, and more recently from 2016 to 17. And what these excavations have thrown up is huge quantities, especially with the recent excavations, relatively, of imported Mediterranean pottery. Very high quality tableware, and also larger amphora for bringing goods that people wouldn't have had access to in Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries typically. Olive oil, wine. And what the recent excavations at the most recent excavations at Tintagel have shown are that there is a division between the pottery that is used for carrying goods, the amphorae, and the pottery that is used as tableware, that they are found in bulk in different parts of the island, showing a certain organisation to this. There's more of this type of pottery at Tintagel than in all of the rest of Britain combined. What does this mean? Often people have thought that this is a royal centre where the kings of Dumnonia, a name that survives to us today in the form of Devon, ruled and held feasting and so forth. People sometimes think of it as a place where trade came in. That's quite controversial. There have been lots of arguments about the nature of that coastline, about whether it's navigable or not, whether indeed the pottery is being brought in at Tintagel or whether it's coming overland from the south coast. I'm quite lucky in that one of my students is a very able and budding maritime archaeologist, and he knows that once you get to Tintagel, it becomes much harder to sail up the north coast of Cornwall. Once you get round that headland, you're not really going any further north very easily when you get into the really choppy waters, especially of the Irish Sea. So we can possibly see this as a point that was convenient to stop for traders coming from the Mediterranean. We've also spotted quite a useful rock which could be used to tie against, to prevent a ship from from losing its moorings, and that could have proved very practical in the day. But that's something we'll look at more over time. But you see this extremely prosperous, wealthy culture there existing in Cornwall in the post-Roman period in a way that it didn't during the Roman period itself, and that raises all sorts of questions. Of course, Tintagel's most famous to many people for its Arthurian connections. Unfortunately, while it is a site of the period that people imagine King Arthur to have lived in, the attribution of it to this figure of Arthur, that only comes much later in the Middle Ages, many centuries after it's used. In fact, as great a time span pretty much separates the use of Tintagel as a site like that from when these Arthurian legends appear to between those legends and ourselves today. Even so, Arthuriana, the idea of looking for Arthur and things like that, has really affected a lot of the direction of archaeology in Cornwall, or at least the starting point that we've gone off since. An example of that is a hill fort that I've been looking at and doing field work at recently, called Castle Door near Parr. Castle Door is an Iron Age hill fort, but it lies close to a stone inscription bearing the name Drustan. Drustan is a Pictish name, but it's the name Tristan, Tristan being one of the most famous characters from Arthurian legend. Unfortunately, Raleigh Radford, who I mentioned earlier, he excavated Castle Door a long time ago. He found rectilinear structures which he thought could not be Iron Age. His basis was that you do not get rectilinear Iron Age structures. Unfortunately, now we know that's not quite true. He also found a lot of pottery, and he claimed that some of that pottery was of the type that he found at Tintagel, that imported ware from the 5th and 6th centuries. Unfortunately, those pottery sherds have gone missing in the meantime, and they're nowhere to be found. So Castle Door has been reappraised as not really having any clear evidence for post-Roman reoccupation of the kind that we see at so many hill forts like Dinas Powys in South Wales, or Dinas Emrys in North Wales. The other aspect, though, to Castle Door is that some decades ago aerial photographs were taken showing outlines in the field beyond. These lines are not visible to the naked eye on the surface, but a few years ago a geophysical study was conducted by the Cornwall Archaeological Unit, revealing not only that these lines, these are coming up through magnetometry survey, but there are even more features, circular features as well. And what these appear to be are outworks of the main hill fort, additional fortifications built at some point. When? That's really the question, because it could feasibly be that they were built in the Iron Age when the hill fort itself was constructed. It could be that there was indeed some kind of reoccupation, that there were these Tintagel type imported sherds of imported pottery that were there at some point. And it's also possible that these are fortifications from the Civil War, because Castle Door lies on the battlefield of the Battle of Lostwithiel. So we've been field walking there recently. We expect at some point probably to encounter a musket ball or two, and now we're looking to put some test pits in the interiors of where these lines are, to see if we can start to come up with a few finds that will give us some clues to how we'll then conduct a full excavation across these historical these outworks, whatever they are indeed. But there is so much coming out of archaeology in Cornwall at the moment. It's unfortunately relatively underfunded, but hopefully we'll get clearer answers over the next few years. So when we think of the appreciation of heritage, we think of it as quite a modern phenomenon, or at least one of the last 2 centuries, really emerging with the rise of Romanticism from around the year 1800. But certain things can show us a much more complex picture going back, and Tintagel is a brilliant example of how people in the past had a sense of heritage and an appreciation of these things that we don't always give them credit for. There were extant visible ruins of the great stone post-Roman settlement at Tintagel in the high medieval period, when Geoffrey of Monmouth claimed it as the birthplace of King Arthur. At this, a few decades later, Richard, Earl of Cornwall, the younger brother of King Henry III, decided to build a castle at Tintagel. This castle was not a useful one, really. It was not defensively valuable. It was not in any key position controlling territory or any major routes. It was purely there because of the Arthurian associations of the site, because you had these ruins from many centuries ago that excited people, that interest in heritage. And this is really when the craze of King Arthur is sweeping Europe, and Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain is the equivalent of a bestseller, really. We have hundreds of medieval manuscripts of it. We'd usually consider 20 to be quite a lot for any medieval manuscript. So Richard builds this castle, and he builds it in a very interesting way. He builds it in what's quite old-fashioned for the time, really. It's more what you'd expect to see in the later 12th century, not into the mid 13th century when Richard builds it, clearly evoking a sense of the archaic when he sets it up. Of course, he doesn't seem to go there much because it's quite far out of the way. Richard's busy going on crusade and trying to become the Holy Roman Emperor. And of course, Tintagel gets incredibly windy all year round, and is very cold in the winter. That's partly why some people argue that it's only occupied seasonally at times in the post-Roman period. But the thing we've got to remember is that's how medieval kingship worked. People didn't live in the same castle all year round. They were going round the country, consuming the agricultural surplus, visiting lots of people, staying at their various residences throughout the land. And that's the model that applies equally to kings of the post-Roman period as much as it does to the nobility of the higher medieval period, like Richard of Cornwall.
As we conclude our journey through Cornwall's historic places, we leave with a deeper appreciation for a land shaped by myth, memory, and resilience. From ancient stone circles and windswept castles to mines that fueled empires, Cornwall's past lives on in its landscapes and legends. Its history is not just preserved in stone, but in stories passed down through generations, stories of kings, saints, miners, and seafarers. Thank you for joining us as we uncovered the rich heritage of this remarkable region. Until next time, keep exploring the places where history still speaks. This is Time Stream. See you next time.